So I've just finished a mainstream fiction book, which I did quite like. That makes a nice change, doesn't it? The Beekeeper of Aleppo. This is a book that is about 4 years old. It's been nominated for various Peacekeeper prizes and other things. I can't quite remember all of them. It seems to be a book that everyone loves, and I was kind of interested but cautious. Award-winning books, in my estimation, are often bad. And books which everyone loves, I tend to wait a few years before reading them, because there's always a new best book that everyone is thrilled about and it's going to change their world, and about 2 years later half of them are books that people barely even remember. Beekeeper of Aleppo, I liked it. It was pretty good. It didn't change my world. I'd probably give it 3 out of 4 stars. No, 3 out of 5 stars. It's meant to be courageous, provocative and haunting. I don't think it's going to haunt me. I suspect that the people for whom it changed their world and who are utterly haunted and whose life is changed by it are people who either have never really known very much about refugee situations in the Middle East and Europe, or those people who know too much, who have either experienced it themselves or work with people who are experiencing those things. For them it'll probably haunt. For me it's just a nicely written book that worked quite well. Courageous and provocative. I think that's just one of those things that publishers say about books. It could have been courageous and provocative to write about something you didn't have any experience with, but my understanding is that the author has actually done a lot of work with refugees. And I also understand that most of the things that happen in this book came from discussions that she had and stories that were shared with her while she was a volunteer at UNICEF in Athens. A certain amount of this book takes place in Athens. So I'd say it's probably not as provocative as it would be if it had been written by someone with no experience. Obviously, it's not her experiences. So it starts with the Beekeeper of Aleppo. His name is Nouri and his wife is Afra, and they're living in Aleppo. They are normal people. He's a beekeeper in business with his cousin, and they have a happy life. It's a normal, happy life that is unremarkable. They're married, they have a son, they're living in the city, in a country they love, they're happy. And then comes, as anyone who's aware of international events, comes the Arab Spring, the protests against Assad. And then you had militants take over the country. Now, I can't pretend to really, truly understand the political situation in Syria. I'm not entirely sure that many people do. But I know it started out with, is he president or prime minister? Assad, anyway. It was a totalitarian regime. People protested. The protesters split. I think there are now at least 5 different protesting groups. There's the militants that support the Assad regime. There's at least 2 ones who've created interim governments. I think one of them's secular and one isn't. There's a whole heap of bad stuff happening. It includes bombs and people shot and normal people unable to live their lives and having to flee the country that they love and don't want to have to leave. And that's where this book sort of begins. A bomb went off, killing their child, which leaves Afra blind and refusing to leave. Now, at this point, I've got to admit, I had very little patience with this woman. Sure, her son died there. Trauma. I get it. She can't see. I mean, going on a refugee trek across the Middle East and Europe when you're blind, that would be terrifying, but it doesn't seem to be that. She's in trauma-induced state. She's retreating from reality. I get that people do that. I will never have patience with people who do things that are clearly not a survival tactic. It's just not something that I have a lot of patience with in books or reality. If she had have left initially, she'd have been better off, because she'd have left with 2 people to protect her. Instead, they flee at the last moment when Nouri is about to be shot by militants because he refuses to take up a gun and be one of them. So we get Aleppo, we get a bit of Aleppo before it becomes horrible, we get a bit of Aleppo after it's become horrible. We get their trip overland to Istanbul, being people smuggled across borders and rivers and other horrible things. We get a little bit of Istanbul. We then get them being smuggled and transported through to Athens. The refugee centres in Athens sound truly horrible, I've got to say. With all due respect to the people who are maintaining them and conditions that are atrocious and probably could never be good, they sound horrific. They do cross the sea in a boat. I believe the crossing is from Turkey to Greece, and there is a little bit of an incident there. By now, the characters have shifted a fair bit. We start off with Afra being horrendously damaged and Nuri caring for her. By now we're starting to see a lot of damage in Nuri, and we're starting to suspect that he is experiencing deep trauma responses and he is entirely unaware of it. They then stay in Athens for quite some time, where mostly bad things happen, and they end up in England. In the UK, they're in a hostel, which is a relatively safe and clean environment, but they're applying for refugee status, which of course is difficult and traumatic. Overall, this book is full of bad things, but it's somehow so nicely written that you don't feel like it's terrible. It's very nicely written. I don't think it will traumatize most listeners, but it might make people think. If you have got no background experience of refugee status from Africa and the Middle East, I mean, I don't know where you've been for these last however many years, but if you don't, this is probably a book that you should read because you'll learn a lot from it. It motivated me into reading up a little bit on trauma response and post-traumatic stress disorder, two things I know a little bit about, but it motivated me to reading more, so that was good. I do recommend it. I will, I suspect, forget it in a few years. Hopefully not, but I might. Yeah. Good book. Would recommend. Good to read on the beach in the sun. Like and comment. Do comment. And maybe subscribe.